guys, I hope you are doing well today. I was just repotting some of these cuttings that had been jammed and ignored for a while. A long while, like 8 months. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to mention something while I'm in the middle of this and thinking about it, and that is when you have a plant that stretches out. I'm trying to grab a couple examples here, like this lovely guy here, this lovely guy here, like this, and you know it is supposed to be some kind of a compact, much more rosette-like plant. For example, this guy here, this is some kind of a Graptivaria or Graptosedum. This guy should look a lot more similar. See how tall he is. So if they stretch out and you wonder what to do, a lot of people say behead them, which is true, and which that just means you take the top. Let me grab one here. So you see all this, let me remove this. See all this stem here? You just take the top, cut it off, and replant this into a pot like that. Only this isn't going to go in this pot. This pot is already full of happy heads. But a lot of people don't realize why we strip back the leaves, and that's what I wanted to mention. So for this guy in particular, say this was just a plant that you really, really loved, and you're sad that it stretched out in your window because it wasn't getting quite enough light over the winter, and you just feel really bad about cutting it all off. So you think to yourself, okay, look, here's this little rosette coming off down here, so we'll cut it off down here. And then we can plant this root section back, and this guy will continue to produce some new offsets, and this guy will grow into another plant. That's a fantastic, fantastic thing. Totally what I do. And then you get to this guy, and a lot of people, you'll watch them do plant videos, and they'll just be stripping off these leaves like crazy. I'm sure there's been a few videos where I've been doing that, just bang, bang, bang. And it's like, oh no, I'm losing all of my pretty leaves, and that's so sad. So maybe I'll only take off just, you know, the bottom, maybe 3 or 4, like that. So there's enough stem to plant, but I'll leave the rest of these on so that I don't have to feel so bad about stripping them back to tiny, tiny, tiny. You can do that, but the problem with that is we're not just stripping the leaves back for aesthetic. A lot of times that's what we talk about in the middle of a video. We'll say, oh, well, you know, it doesn't quite look right yet, and we'll just keep taking these off. We'll keep twisting, we'll take a look, and we'll say, nah, these two don't quite need to go there, and we'll get up, and then we'll be like, well, that's about like I like it, and we'll plant it, and that's all we'll say as the people in the videos. But one of the main reasons that we strip back this many leaves is to give the cutting a better chance of survival, because once we've removed it from its root system, obviously now it has to keep all of these live leaves alive, plus it has to put a ton of energy into making new roots. So if we remove a majority of the leaves from a stem and only leave the nicest, best ones, that gives the plant a lot better chance of survival and just being healthy in general. So if you think you're being nice to your plant by leaving on extra leaves when you're doing a cutting, think again. And I totally understand the impulse, for sure. I got dirt on my elbow here. You can see the mess I got going on. I totally understand the impulse, for sure, of, oh, leave more leaves. And even with as long as I've been doing plants, I still sometimes think, oh, but I just need to leave a few more because they're so pretty. But it's really, really not advantageous for the plant. I'm going to pause for just a second and come back. I have to grab a different plant to show you something else really quick. Alrighty, I'm back. So this is the only kind of Opuntia prickly pear type variety that I have to show on, and I'm such a visual person, so I thought I would just grab these really quick. You may have seen online some of the, you know, more paddle cactus type varieties like these, even the smaller ones where someone's rooting some, and they have cut out maybe a whole heart like a cookie cutter, if you just imagine cutting it out of the entire thing. So there's just a huge gaping hole in the middle shaped like a heart, or sometimes they'll do eyes and a mouth like a jack-o'-lantern or something. in these leaves. And I've seen a lot of people do this not knowing why it's done, just for fun. They're like, well, I think it's cute. And so they make cut a face out of their cactus petal. And on the opposite side of that, I see a lot of people just horrified and saying, oh my goodness, how could you do that to your plant? Just to make it look good, you're just gonna cut it up like that? You know, that's terrible. And it makes me chuckle a little bit because there's actually a reason that this got started. It just seems that most people don't necessarily perpetuate the reason behind it. If you guys have ever heard the story of the mom cooking a ham every Christmas and cutting the end off every year, cutting the end off, and the daughter grew up and got married, and every year she cut the end off of her ham, and someone asked why, and she said, well, that's just what you do. And come to find out, her mother's pan that she always cooked her ham in was just a little bit too small, and she always had to cut the end off. And there's really no reason, if your pan is big enough, to leave it. And that is kind of a sentiment that gets perpetuated in all areas of life, and the plant world is definitely one. There's a ton of things that get done, and very few people saying why. And the reason why is, for a large paddle cactus like this, even though this is one leaf, technically speaking, this is a lot of flesh and tissue to keep alive while it's trying to develop roots. It just really is. And so the traditional, more practical way to do it that's not cute is just to cut half of the leaf off and to throw away this top half before rooting the bottom half. And that gives the leaf less plant matter to worry about, and it's able to devote a lot more energy into making the roots. Now, they can do just fine without being cut at all, but if there is any kind of stress, or you think it's less likely to root, having a smaller leaf can help. And so that's kind of the normal. If you've ever seen African violets propagated, they're the same way. You take a leaf and you stick the stem into dirt, but most of the time you'll cut the top of the leaf off, just so the plant A, knows that it's not supposed to focus on growing leaves right now, and B, so that it, just stabbed myself with the cactus. B, so that it knows to, or so that it can focus more energy on making roots. And so when people cut out holes or a smiley face out of a leaf, it's very different than doing it to a whole plant that's already well established and then just cutting random holes in the leaf. That would weaken the plant, and it's likely to introduce bacteria, and other problems can become apparent after you do that if you were just cutting up leaves on a happily growing plant. But when the leaf has already been separated from the plant for the purpose of rooting, keeping this much material alive can be more stress on the plant, and so sometimes we just remove part of the material. And you can do that in a cute way by cutting a heart out of the middle, or you can do it in a more ugly way by cutting just half of the leaf off. But anyways, if you've ever seen that done, faces and whatnot in cacti, they're not actually hurting their plant. They're actually helping it focus on rooting. And then obviously when it grows out, it'll grow out healthy, happy, whole new petals. All right, I decided to butt in with another video. As I was editing this video together, I thought, you know what, I didn't make that quite clear enough. And again, like I said, I'm so visual. So I'm going to use one of these African violets to demonstrate a little bit. I'm not sure what's going on with this guy right now. He's blooming really weird underneath the leaves. See this? Anyways, but that's not what matters. What I'm going to do is cut a leaf off here and just talk a tiny bit about normal propagation techniques. This doesn't get talked about a ton with succulents from what I've seen, but is much more common to be discussed just in general plant propagation. So with African violets, you can just cut them off a leaf and plant them. A lot like the opuntia that we were just talking about, the cactuses. And what a lot of times people do is this. This gets thrown away. This gets planted. Now this does several things, which I was talking about, but one of them is when the leaf has this much surface area, okay, it has to retain enough moisture and nutrients to then develop roots, because there is nothing, the plant will not absorb any nutrients or any water through this stem until there are roots. It's not like a flower that you're poking in a vase and it's sucking up water. It's not going to do that. It's going to be planted in dirt, and it's not going to be absorbing anything that will help it until it's developing roots. And so transpiration is what happens when plants absorb water through their roots and evaporate it out through their leaves. And when we have a large leaf surface like this, or like the cactus, which I'll go back to in just a second, the amount of water that evaporates off can sometimes be too much and give the plant a lot less of a chance of surviving. And so when we take part of the leaf off, even though, yes, it's taking part of the moisture with it, of course, what is left is evaporating off at about half of the rate, because all of the pores in this leaf that are slowly releasing moisture are gone. And this wound calluses off really quickly, so it's not losing a bunch of moisture. And then the stem, which is what which is where the goodies that we're wanting and the good roots are obviously going to come out. The stem is able to focus on its roots more. The other advantage is when you cut a leaf like this, it tells the leaf itself that I am no longer viable. And so rather than trying to grow any more on this actual leaf, which we don't want because we want it to develop a plant, it will put its effort into making roots and then making a whole nother little plant at the base here. When we don't cut the leaf, sometimes the plant can think, oh, I'm still a whole leaf, maybe I can root and continue growing, which is not what we want. We want it to make an offset. And so yeah, so these guys, cutting a piece off can really be advantageous for multiple reasons. It gives them a better chance of rooting, partially because just of the water stress and the evaporation being eliminated. Some people do, instead of, which African violets aren't a really good way to show this because the leaves are too hard, but instead of cutting a piece across like this with like leaves more tree-like or leafy leaves that aren't quite as thick as these, they will roll them up, which I'm going to end up crunching this, but that's okay. They will roll them up like this, only imagine it was the whole leaf, and put like an elastic band gently around them to hold them rather than cutting them off. And this helps reduce the surface area of the leaf that is exposed to the air and reduce transpiration so that the plant can hold more moisture and put more energy into making its roots. So you don't have to cut them by any chance. This is just why. I just wanted to explain why people do this. Another theory is that, well, we know this isn't a theory. When you wound a plant, hormones are released, and some of those hormones are rooting hormones. And so when we take a cutting, the actual cutting part, the reason if we take a leaf and bend it down when it's still attached to the mother plant and pin it down that it roots slower is because the wound actually releases these rooting hormones. And this is a survival mechanism from the plant, so that if their leaves get damaged by wind or an animal eating part of them, etc., and breaking something off and it falling on the ground, that it can root or is more likely to root, or the wound that is left on the plant is more likely to send out new shoots because of the growth hormone that has been released. Some people wonder or question, or there's theories that because a wound releases hormones, that doing another wound up here causes even more hormones to be released into the plant stem, and that speeds up rooting. Now, I haven't seen any actual hardcore studies proving this, so it's just a theory, but it is an interesting thing to consider, and it's really hard to say whether trimming this would actually influence the amount of hormones in the plant or not. Yeah, anyways, but that is why people do it, and I'm going to go back to the opuntia and finish talking there. Also, as we know, most of, well, not most, but many of the succulent plants that we love to work with, the leaves will propagate if you want to mess with it into babies. It takes quite a long time. Some people, well, a lot of people wonder, what am I doing wrong? Because it takes so long to get a tiny leaf plant into a baby. I'm seeing if I have one. I think all of my leaf trays that are really going good are upstairs, but here's one just to give you an example. If this will show up, this tiny little baby. You can see how tiny that little baby is, right? It's growing on the end of this leaf. And this is a good size echeveria here, so it's actually, no, this is, I think, some kind of a graptosedum. But anyways, this has been in that tray for probably 8 months, and you see how tiny it is? Which, granted, these have been being pretty neglected. I'm not super invested in any of my starts. I throw leaves into a starting tray because why not? I don't want to throw them away. That would be sad, and they might make babies, but if they don't, I really don't care. And so they don't get a ton of TLC, and so it takes longer. If you miss them every day or every other day or whatever, they can grow a bit faster, but still, it takes a long time to go from leaf propagation to full plant kind of material. It's a lot better if you'd use a whole full cutting when you're doing it instead of just a leaf as far as propagating faster. Sorry about that. My husband's on the volunteer firefighter department, and there was just a wreck and he had to head out and rushed in with his radio going. So I paused it right quick because of all the noise. Anyways, that is it for today, I think. I just wanted to mention about stripping the leaves back on these etiolated cuttings, which again means that they're just really stretched out, which almost all of these type of succulents that grow in this form eventually stretch out. Like, this is just kind of par for the course on most of these. Even if they're getting enough light, they just slowly grow, right, and get stretched out. So eventually we almost always either plant them deeper, unless they're outdoors. If they're in pots, if they're outdoors, they lay over on the soil and reroot themselves, and they're just happy and whatever. But indoors in pots, we have to give them a little bit more help. And so we almost always end up either just repotting them a little bit deeper or cutting them off and restarting them at some point. Of course, for plants like aloes and lithops and conophytums that are completely different forms, those guys don't behave in the same way. But the echeveria, the sedum, the graptosedum, the graptivaria, the aeoniums, so many of those types of succulents, they all are going to eventually stretch out and probably get longer than we anticipate or want. And so cutting them off and starting them back in the pot is great. And if you have a whole pot full, which I'm sure I've said this before, but if you have an entire pot full, cutting them off and leaving the rooted stems in, even if there's no leaves on them, most often, if the stems are healthy, they will send up shoots and little offsets and babies. Anyways, this guy, no, this guy doesn't have this guy's just a stem. I cut all of his babies off, but I had, oh, it's over there it's in a bucket soaking in water. But it had some little babies growing. But like this first one I showed you here had a little new offset going here, and you could remove all of the leaves except for this offset and just plant it up to there and have this start as a new plant. But even if this offset wasn't here, if we just cut this stem off and left it sitting, sometimes if they have no leaves, the root will slowly die, but more often than not, they will, as long as they're not kept too wet. Remember that as soon as you remove all of the leaves off of your plant, it cannot utilize and transpire moisture almost at all, because there's no leaves to be evaporating things off, utilizing it, etc. So their water needs go to almost nothing. And so if you have the rooted end of a plant like this, that you have cut the top off of, and if it just has a couple little leaves left like this or none at all, just barely water it. You know, give it a little bit of a mist just to make sure it's not bone dry. But if you water the soil, there's just, yes, there's roots, so we think, okay, it's not a cutting, it's roots, so I should water it. But the roots have nothing, they're not going to soak up and utilize nearly as much because there's nowhere for it to go. And so they're going to sit there in a wet pot and likely rot, which is exactly what we don't want. So when you have the bare ends like this, do make sure and leave them much more on the dry side, no matter what time of year it is. They do want a little bit of moisture because obviously they're going to be trying to put out new sets of leaves, but they get a lot of moisture out of the air also, and some mists or very light waterings if they are in a really warm environment is okay. Putting them in direct sunlight, like really harsh sunlight, isn't a great idea because they're stressed. They're not stressed in a bad way, but they are kind of stressed. But the harsh sun can just tire them out and make them less likely to send out more leaves and more shoots, and more likely to just go, oh well, all my leaves were taken away, I think I'll just die. So moderate, you know, bright light is great. They definitely need bright light or they're just gonna die altogether. But really hot direct sun, especially outside, isn't great if you're trying to recover these ends. Now, if you're working in a flower bed where you have these planted outside, if you live in California or somewhere where they're able to grow outside without protection, and you have a large bed of, you know, Graptosedum or something like that, and you're wanting to trim them all off, you can totally trim them all off. It's just more advantageous usually to do it in the spring or the fall instead of the midsummer when it's really hot and the sun is really likely to stress them. So keep that in mind. Alrighty, that's it for today. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day. I will talk to you soon, and happy growing.